you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Very well. Now, you were on my pilot episode of this very show, The Gauntlet, that aired before the Lambster kicked off, and therefore you are not on the high score table. But you're coming back for a proper episode, and I guess now we're going to see uh, the master at work. You're the first guest who's got prior experience with the Gauntlet.
I
So
know,
how
right?
do you
I
feel
know.
coming into it?
I feel prepared this time.
Yeah. All right. Round one: music, economics, or cosmology.
Music.
The emotional authenticity of music has been diluted. Some music genres are better than others, or live music is more important than recorded music. I'm trying to remember what you did for the first show. Do you
I think it
remember?
was economics because Marx came up.
Ah, aha, yeah, okay.
Some musical genres are better than others. We'll do that one.
All right. I know you're going to be arguing yes to this.
Yes.
Okay, hit it.
All right. So this sort of is a broader commentary on art in general, but listening to classical music, and the classical music as a narrow genres of the 18th century, but it's often loosely termed to describe everything from like the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance, up to like the 20th century, with this sort of like highly ornate, structured musical format with things like symphonies, operas, oratorios, cantatas, sonatas, and all of these things. And what makes a musical genre, and you look at the 20th century, and you see this with literature as well, the level of complexity and range and scope just falls apart. Like complete tripe and schlock is what's put on the radio. I mean, turn on the radio and all the pop songs sound the same. Like there's no effort. It's all simulated, right? So the first thing is modern music sucks because it's the product of a synthetic environment, right? So, for example, let's look at like Dvorak, right? He wrote the Slavonic dances, right? His classical piece was the outgrowth of a lived culture, right? Or you can think of the New World Symphony by Dvorak, which is inspired in parts by the Negro spirituals. So this is a high, like an upgrade of an already existing cultural artifact that's a part of a lived community. Modern music is not. It's synthetic. It's the result of partly ad campaigns, right? The record labels that backed the Beatles wanted to make money. That's why it was there. It wasn't a part of an organic culture. It was a part of a campaign to make money selling records. Unlike, say, the New World Symphony, which is inspired by Dvorak's Visiting of the New World, and this idea of incorporating already existing cultural artifacts, in this case, musical artifacts, into a more refined sense of music. So any musical genre that is in itself an expression of a lived community experience is going to be better than one that is not. And modern music, now it's not a sharp break, right? Like right at the beginning of modernity, there's still connections to real lived communities, and so the music still has some oomph to it. But now you get to like 21st century, and you get just the terrible pop music. It's not pointing to anything. It's just a record on skipping. And so the second thing is a musical genre, and this is why I chose classical music, is there has to be a complexity in the level of the musical production, different tone and timbre, different ranges, right? I mean, the dynamic range of, say, like some of Beethoven's symphonies, like the Ninth, if there's those really quiet parts where you have to crank up the volume, and then when it gets to the loud parts, it blows your ears out because there's so much dynamic range that if you don't have a good speakers, you have to turn it back down again. That kind of stuff you don't really see much anymore.
If you look at the waveform of a pop song, it's like a sausage. It's just flat.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you take the waveform of even contemporary classical music, you will see there's loud parts, there's quiet parts, there's real dynamic range.
Right. So it actually takes a lifetime of study and hard work and no small amount of innate talent to be able to produce these works of art. Um, and of course, any other musical genre that doesn't, and I'll just keep on dunking on modern music, is not as good because you don't have to be as good, right? A lot of these, like Madonna, is just a suit. She's an empty suit. I mean, any other woman could have done the Madonna role. They just chose her for it for reasons, right? It's just totally simulated.
I don't know if I agree that anyone could be. You could replace anyone as a pop star. I actually think the people who make it as pop stars today have some kind of magnetic, charismatic quality. That's not necessarily to say
Yeah.
that is the same thing as talent. I'm not
Right.
saying that the reasons that they're successful is because they're hardworking or that it's a good thing that these people have reached the top. But I think if you picked like 1,000 random people out of the population, even if you pared it down to 1,000 women who are, of a relatively healthy and athletic and so on, still none of them would be anywhere near Madonna's level of kind of there's some star quality.
I mean, yes and no, right? Because with the whole point, and we're seeing it now with the complete trash Hollywood and modern music has been putting out for cultural artifacts, it doesn't really matter anymore. It's an entirely simulated situation. So you could just be totally terrible and you'd still make money because there's the built-in demand for the consumption of this product. Now, a lot of us in our circles here would complain about the fall in quality, but a lot of people still did like 7, 8, and 9 of Star Wars, right? Normies, right? And so it didn't really matter that this wasn't as good as, say, an earlier version or something like that. And certainly it's not like, I mean, I think Beethoven was like, he composed music while he was blind. Like, I mean, no, deaf. He was deaf. It's crazy. He was so attuned with his craft that he could still hear it in his head, right? And then write the music while he was deaf in his old age. And then the other thing that makes a musical genre better than another is its intent, its purpose, right? If music is to degrade, right, you could have dissonance, and dissonance is degrading. So for example, I think it was during Waco, the government would actually like blast dissonant music to get under the skin of the Branch Davidians, and in other standoff situations, kind of like psychological warfare, they would do that. And so that kind of music is degrading because it's meant to disrupt and put you on edge. Whereas, like, again, well, let's go back to Beethoven or my favorite, Handel's and Messiah. Music that's done well, genres that are done well, can elevate the spirit to a higher spiritual plane. And there's a saying in Lord Dunsany's King of Elfland's Daughter that something can only be spoken of in song or poetry. And that's true. There's certain things that you can really only communicate in song or poetry, and musical genres and musical performances that participate in that ethereal, esoteric quality are objectively better than those that don't. So as a recap, what makes one musical genre better than another is the level of complexity, dynamic range. It's a complex work. The other is that it brings you to this higher sense of spiritual development. And then thirdly, it is the product of a lived organic community, right? Even if you're living in the city, which is somewhat inorganic, you're still inspired by the organic. So Dvorak is still inspired by Slavonic folk dances and Negro spirituals. So if you meet all three of those, that means you're a superior, solid genre.
I think on the first point, I'm not entirely convinced that complexity is always makes something better. And actually, like, my main issue when I'm trying to do something creative is simplifying things. I don't have any trouble with making something very complex. So I actually admire sometimes the simplicity of modern music. But both of your other points, I think, are very strong. I do agree that um, the intent of a lot of modern music is not very high. It's not bringing you to a spiritual place. It's not celebrating parts of life that are edifying. And I also agree that modern music is not the product of a genuine, organic community. It's this weird internet age has turned everything into a dead silicon like ghost of prior art. So on the basis that you gave me 3 independent arguments and 2 of them were very successful, I'm going to give you 14 points. Now I looked up what your total score was for your your previous round. Do you remember what it was? Your previous show?
I don't remember.
Your total score was 18.5. So I'd say you're off to a strong start. That's true. All right, next round. Ethics, history, and metaphysics.
Man, those are all very interesting questions. Let's do ethics.
Ethics is fundamentally relational. Animals deserve the same ethical consideration as humans, or preserving the environment is a moral duty.
I'm going to do preserving the environment is a moral duty in the affirmative.
All right, let's hear it.
All right, so the first thing is let's look at the word conservation. I mean, the root is conserve, and in one sense, that's also the same root word of conservatism, which is to conserve. Now, if we talk about community, and since we just talked about music, community was one of the things that can create music and therefore makes good music. You can't have a community without an environment that you're living in. There was this documentary I watched about Earth First. I think it came out like in the 90s, but I watched it like in the 2010s. And there's this really goofy song at the end called Habitat, where it's like you need to have a habitat. And it's kind of catchy, it's kind of corny, but it sort of gets to the point that, yeah, like we don't live in this we're living down this deracinated silicon urban environment whereby we don't really have this interaction with anything really real, right? And partly that's because either we're living in an urban area and we don't really have an environment to speak of, or the environment we do have is just degraded and polluted and destroyed. And so it's like we're missing it. So, for example, in the late Roman Republic, so it's like the 2nd century, one of the Catos said that he was a critic of urban life, saying that, a man loses something when he moves into the city. The Romans needed to keep their Roman values, he argued, needed to remain on the land, needed to remain a yeoman population. Of course, the call of wealth and success, of course, drew people to the cities. But, Cato is pointing to this deep spiritual reality that we need to be connected to the land. And so in the same way that a conservative would want to preserve certain ethical, moral norms, I think we can view the environment in a similar fashion, specifically that environment in which we are now living. And if we do live in a city and don't have an environment, then maybe that's something we need to fix. Because if you think about it, you could argue the first experience that we have as humans is with the immediate surroundings that we're born into. And, if we live in a synthetic environment where we don't have access to the real, I think it has a lot of long-term deleterious consequences for development. Whereas if you have an environment that is functioning properly and is not, polluted or deracinated or pillaged, then you can, you're able to then, have these more fully formed human experiences. And then furthermore, the question is, you really have only one of 2 options when it comes to the land that you're living on. Are you going to plan on living there indefinitely for you and future generations? In which case, some form of, dare I say it, sustainable living is necessary, because if you pillage it all now, then future generations will have to leave and go somewhere else. And then, or you could just pillage it. And so the thing is, well, what's more likely to produce the kinds of moral results that we want, a conservative or a Christian or a generally, more real society? Well, if we're not constantly moving around like digital nomads, pillaging one spot from the next, right? If we're not doing that, then we're more likely to be able to develop these kinds of cultural and social arrangements that we want, but they are themselves embedded in an environment that we're living in, right? And now from the Christian point of view, more specifically, it's interesting to note that the law of Moses speaks a lot to, it's not couched in these terms because it would be anachronistic to do so, but a lot of them have positive environmental consequences. Like, for example, the Jubilee and Sabbath years, where agricultural work is suspended for a Sabbath is every 7 years, and then the Jubilee it's for 2 years, the 49th and 50th year. Also, a lot of the unclean animals that you weren't supposed to eat were scavengers. So they would, their nature's cleanup crew, they clean up dead animals. So if you, ate too much of them, then no one's going to be eating the carcasses, which will then spread disease. There's an interesting chapter in a book called the Paleo Manifesto called Moses the Microbiologist, where it goes into these details. And then also in Revelation, there's an interesting bit where God says he will destroy those who destroy the land. So go ahead.
I was just wondering whether preserving the environment is too low of a goal. I think that should almost be the minimum bar. But actually, if we're happy with conserve or preserve, that could almost become it could almost become shackles, where what we should be aiming to do is improve the environment. And it wasn't the original instruction given to mankind, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish in the sea, the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And of course, Adam was to be the gardener. That was his role, not leave the Garden of Eden as he found it, but actually to cultivate it. And sometimes I think the rightful repulsion we have towards destroying the natural world also leads us to condemn people who are seeking to cultivate the natural world. So would you see a role for humanity actually in improving on the way that God gave us the earth?
Yeah, I mean, bare preservation, I would agree, is a minimum. Like, that's like in like I guess an interpersonal ethics. Don't punch someone in the nose, right? That's just the basis. You don't stop there; you start there, right? So, yeah, but then improving that for future generations and other things like that, sure. That's something as well. And so I think what's interesting too is if you look again at like not only the biblical account, but also just like classical thought in general, this sort of like bifurcation of like how we treat the environment, how we treat other individuals, how we organize society or economics. It's not bifurcated, it's integrated. So if you read like modern day times, libertarians, socialists, right? They're very economic centric. They have different economic theories, but they sort of over index in that. And then other aspects are subordinate to that. Whereas like, Solon or Lycurgus or Numa, the great lawgivers of Athens, Sparta, and Rome, they have this integrated belief, right? All aspects of life are covered. And part of this, why the question I think is even phrased this way, is because we do live in this sort of bifurcated, fragmented society, in which case you wouldn't have thought about that before, right? The way that the ancient Israelites were to engage with the land around them was central to the law that was given them, specifically in Leviticus 25, when God tells them how to use it. So we don't think about that anymore because we're so far separated from the land, and also because we have a sort of fragmented sense of self when it comes to these ethical and moral issues.
Great. Well, I think that was excellent. So I'm going to give you 15 points for that round, meaning that you've now blown your previous score out of the water.
Yep.
And on to round 3. Cinema and theatre, world affairs, or epistemology?
Cinema and theater.
Entertainment is the primary utility of cinema. Casting should reflect demographic realities, or creators have a moral responsibility to challenge society.
Now, could you just clarify the first one? When you say entertainment is the primary utility of cinema, do you mean just like diversions?
You're asking, what do I mean by entertainment? I'd say I'd say that entertainment can be a facet of an activity without commenting on whether or not it is providing, other things as well. You could have something that's both entertaining and actually really valuable, like teaches you life lessons or builds you up spiritually or whatever it is. I'd say it's an element. Maybe entertainment is connected to the alleviation of boredom. I don't know. Maybe it's connected to our play instincts.
Okay, I was just curious.
Sure.
I'm going to do creators have a moral responsibility to challenge society. Affirmative. All right. So now, obviously, we can think of the culture of critique and the left endlessly challenging society with their artistic creations, and on one hand, those of us on the right are going to be a little skeptical of that because it's like, well, we've seen these ideological Bolsheviks just take hammer and tongs to everything, and yeah, that's an unhelpful way to challenge society. It's a deconstructionist, but I think there are ways in which it is appropriate and good to challenge the society that you're in. So let's use the example of the Old Testament prophets, right? The kingdom of Israel, the laws of Israel were given by God to Moses. So this is a righteous society, but they were deviating from it, right? And so the prophets were constantly haranguing the religious leadership, the king, and the people of Israel to return to their principles. And it's that cycle, okay, that is an important role for what an artist can do, in the sense that there is a sense in which the society that you're in is falling short of its own standards and values, and then also it's stated standards and values, and then there's also the sense in which the society that you're in is falling short of what we might call the sort of Platonic ideals of justice and goodness. And so challenging society to, one, be true to its own statements, and then also to become more closely aligned with these higher principles is an ongoing and I think perennial concern for art and content creators. So, for example, one of my favorite directors of all time is the Japanese director Akira Kurosawa. And one of the things that he does is he makes a lot of very incisive films criticizing elements of Japanese society. Now, he's not doing this as someone who's anti-Japanese trying to deconstruct Japan, right? It's not like a ideological Bolshevik. He's trying to point out something that Japan can learn from. A good example is his film The Bad Sleeps Well, where he points out a lot of the cruelty and harshness of the corporate culture of Japan at the time. And it's like, it's just, brutal. And he points out that, even the people, and then of course, and there's two people that are affected by this. One of them is somebody who's successful in that culture, but has a string of bad luck and, nearly ruins them. And then there's the criminal in the film who's basically, extreme poverty. And all of this is downstream from this culture of business that he's criticizing. Again, that's a very good example of that. That would be a contemporary era film. Then there's period films of like the Japanese Civil War, the Sengoku, in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. And there's a lot of, insightful commentary, not just by him, but other Japanese directors about, abuses of power and things like that with the warlordism of Japan. So that's one way to do it. The other, so that would be with cinema. But then also when we look at another good example would be C.S. Lewis, right? So specifically with not Narnia, because he's not really criticizing or society, but his space trilogy, specifically That Hideous Strength, where he is actually challenging the technological society and a lot of its implications and what it does. And his satire of the British totalitarian police state, NICE, is it's powerful. It's good. I read it a couple of years ago for the second time, and it definitely highlights the dangers of the technological society. And it's that kind of work that helps us to remember to not go into these other directions. So things like satire can be helpful in that regard, to expose these elements that we don't want. And again, the distinction with the challenge needs to be not challenging for its own sake or a rebel without a cause, like a lot of modern avant-garde work, but challenging the society to, one, return to its principles when it strays away, which is a perennial problem, and then also to the higher principles that we all sort of know exist and fall short of, and remind us of them. And this is not really, I guess you could say, a challenge or critique, but in The Law of Voyage of the Dawn Treader and the Chronicles of Narnia, Lewis tells us why he wrote Narnia in the first place. So when Lucy and Edmund realize they can't return to Narnia because they're too old, then Lucy says, "Will we see you again?" to Aslan. Aslan says, "And I brought you to this world, Narnia, so that you might learn to serve me better in your world." So the idea is that, what Tolkien calls the true myth is a way that we can sort of reframe the discussion back to the first principles that we, have and have a nice reset. So that's where fantasy comes in as being really helpful.
Yeah, you mentioned That Hideous Strength. So here's a little passage from That Hideous Strength, where a character is talking about various different groups' reactions to the media. He says, "Why, you fool? It's the educated reader who can be gulled. All our difficulty comes with the others. When did you meet a workman who believes the papers? He takes it for granted that they're all propaganda and skips the leading articles. He buys his paper for the football results and the little paragraph about the girls falling out of windows and corpses found in Mayfair Flats. He is our problem. We have to recondition him. The educated public, the people who read the highbrow weeklies, don't need reconditioning. They're all right already. They'll believe anything." So this is an example of, I think, a sentiment that could more or less be C.S. Lewis talking himself, or many of us reading it would say, actually, yes, that's pretty accurate. But it's a character within the story expressing his own opinions. So how do you figure out, when you're reading something or watching something, what is the author's commentary versus what is just an opinion of being expressed within the universe and is not meant to reflect the author's opinions?
Well, I think to answer that, you'd have to first know what the author's opinions are before he wrote the book. And now in the case of C.S. Lewis, we do know his opinions. He wrote a lot, spoke a lot. So it's not super hard then to figure out, okay, this speaker is aligned with C.S. Lewis's principles. Probably is Lewis. I mean, in many ways, Ransom is a kind of self-insert character for Lewis. So yeah, I think
even if you had no access to biographical information, I feel like you might be able to tell by the way that Ransom is kind of vindicated throughout the story and is treated, that he's presented in a favorable light, right?
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. So I guess from like an internal perspective, you could look at a character who's constantly tripping up versus a character that's constantly succeeding, and then infer that the author is trying to tell you something with that.
Well, our time has gone, but I'm going to give you 15 again because you're absolutely storming the gauntlet today. There you are, 15. Round 4, psychology, elite theory, or theology. This is a Sophie's choice.
Let's do elite theory.
Mainstream media is a tool in the hands of the elite. Meritocracy is a myth. Or democracy merely provides the veneer of popular control.
All right. Meritocracy is a myth. Opposed.
Okay.
So there's a couple ways you could go about this, and it's not always been clear to me which way, because this is kind of a neo-reactionary talking point. Is that okay? Meritocracy. So our current order, right? Let's call it the GAE, right? Claims that it picks the best, that it's a meritocracy, and we all know that's bogus. So in that sense, the idea that there's a meritocracy in the GAE is a myth. But oftentimes, I think this is taken to be more strongly that meritocracy as such doesn't exist. In fact, there were times on. No, I know Dave the Distributor still does his own solo streams, but when he had more guests on and did more like prepared videos with like editing, I remember him even saying that meritocracy was a myth, and that was a lot of neo-reactionaries who were saying that at the time, and I just didn't. Now, granted, maybe what they meant was the current order, but a lot of times I think they made a case that was too strong, because it's saying just because our current order doesn't have a meritocracy doesn't mean that it's in principle or in theory not doable, right? And so here's an example, right? Let's talk about where meritocracy really is the matter of life and death, and that's war, right? So if you look at before the age of revolutions, so let's say, sorry, the 17th century with the twin English revolutions, the start of the Civil War that killed a king, and then 1688, all the way down to our present time, right? The militaries of Europe were led by aristocrats, and they were not put in charge of armies because they were good at what they did. They were put in charge of armies because of their birth, right? They didn't go to schools to be trained how to be soldiers. They might have had training on an individual level, like they might have been a swordsman, a duelist, a horseback rider, right? So they had like the individual training, but they didn't have the organizational training, and they certainly didn't have officer school training. And so one of the things that we see time and time again, and in the English Civil War is a good example of this, is that the Parliament eventually under the complete control of Oliver Cromwell created a meritocracy in the military, where no matter what your background was, whether you were a brewer, a baker, a farrier, or whatever, you could become an officer if you worked hard enough and demonstrated capacity. Now, of course, the Royalists just never got around to doing that. And they thought, well, we're the blue bloods, we're born to lead, we're just going to win. And, there were, I'm sure, men in their ranks who were privates who could have made officers, but never given the chance. Whereas in the army of the New Model Army, they were. And the New Model Army won, because what matters is results. And if you don't get the results, then you die, because it's a war. And so in this case, the question of merit then becomes, well, good at what? Well, in this case, the art of war itself, organizing and fighting. And the same trend can be observed in the French Revolution, the American Civil War, the Russian Civil War, where the Jacobins, the Union, and the Bolsheviks were they didn't care about these class distinctions. They're like, you might have been born a peasant, but if you can prove yourself, you can be a general. And that didn't always happen, but there was a path to go up, right? There was a way to climb the ladder and become an officer in a way that you couldn't in these reactionary forces. And again, the results are the same. These forces win, right? You can't Or another good example in the pre-revolutionary phase is the Hussites, where these are just peasants, right? But they have their the wagon forts and the spirited leadership of Zizka, and they beat the flower of European chivalry again and again and again. Now they would not predict that they would be beaten by peasants with flails and wagons, but nonetheless they were, because they weren't being promoted based on competency. They were being promoted based on a sort of aristocratic class and back scratching. Now, that's just an obvious historical fact. These people were just better at getting the job done, and they won. There's right. This isn't like a simulation where there's some guy putting the thumb on the scales to make the reactionaries lose. No, this is an open competition. Where may the best man win, right? And so,
could it not be argued that there are other factors apart from whether or not they were employing a meritocracy that determined the outcome of these engagements?
Well, I mean, there's going to be more than one factor, to be sure, but even I was going to say ceteris paribus, meritocracy would be better, but also even if you're at a disadvantage at the beginning, there's a ratchet effect where Napoleon said that it's not the side that makes no mistakes that wins, but the side that makes the fewest in a struggle like this. And so meritocracy, you're hedging against mistakes. You make less mistakes because you have competent people in those positions. But another criticism of meritocracy might be the case: who decides what's best? Because that's not necessarily the same thing as saying meritocracy isn't real. But a lot of people will say, well, we're going to just pretend that it's not real because who's to say what is the best? It's a very libertarian kind of thing. Who's going to decide what this, goal is that we're going to strive for to be excellent at? And they'll say, well, it's going to be the state or something like that. And they don't want to do that. Now, while it is an important question to ask, good at what, meritorious at what, but that's not the same thing as saying that it's a myth. And we could look at also like government or statecraft as well. Now, many in our circles, of course, would point to Prussia and the German state as one that is extremely well run, and one that was extremely efficient, and so it punched far above its weight. So in the 18th century, even though Prussia, had a population I think similar to Great Britain's at the time, Frederick the Great fought France, Russia, and Austria all at the same time. And they were punching way above their weight. And it wasn't just their military organization that did that. It was also their political organization. And then you compare that to, say, like, a Latin country like Spain or some of the Italian principalities, where organization was extremely slipshod and there was just corruption and graft everywhere. I mean, they weren't going to hold a candle to what the Prussian state could do. So I think when it comes to real accomplishments, getting things done, meritocracy is real. It's just that the myth is that the modern global American empire is a meritocracy. That most certainly is not the case.
Okay. Yes. So you're arguing that meritocracy might be a myth right now for certain people who promote this point, but that it has existed in other times, in pockets, and moreover, you're arguing that it's a good thing where it exists.
Yes,
depending on what definition of merit you employ.
Well, and then lastly as well, it could be reproduced again, right? Because whatever comes after the GAE, we can only guess, right? But
might be merit based.
Well,
merit. Jordan Peterson would like that.
A merit-based society would have a competitive advantage against other successors.
Right. Now, if you're comparing two people, one of whom has significantly more natural abilities, kind of latent potential, but has not been raised in an environment that has allowed that to flourish, does a merit-based system promote that person or the person who has had all the advantages and therefore has kind of flourished to the best of their natural abilities, and is
Oh, yeah.
therefore more competent at the moment that you measure them.
So are you asking me the question, does this disadvantage somebody who hasn't had the advantages
Yeah,
of, say, wealth, right? A poor man is going to
sure.
be less educated than a wealthy man, right? And so
Yeah.
does meritocracy see, actually, in this case, meritocracy is an equalizer, I think, because if you were to look at the English Civil War again and these, privates that worked their way up to officers, which you couldn't do in the Royalist Army, they were objectively far poorer than, the king and his nobles. And, you'd be like, well, they're disadvantaged objectively, economically, but given the opportunity to prove themselves, they showed that they were every bit the match of their royalist opposition. And so it could, especially if the kind of merit being measured is a kind of esoteric knowledge. But if it's a kind of like practical performance, I think that's less of a concern.
Well, I believe in merit in this show, and that's why I'm giving you 16 points for that round as a reflection of your merit. Technology, natural sciences, or Christology?
Let's do natural sciences.
A unified theory of physics is the ultimate goal of science. Immediate and radical action on climate change is essential. Or aliens exist. I think the shortest assertion that I have.
Aliens exist. Opposed.
Oh, this is fun. Okay.
Yeah, this is gonna be fun, guys. Okay, so the first thing. Now we need to be careful here. We need to make sure we know what we mean when we say aliens, because most people, when they think of aliens, think of extraterrestrials. Some other biological organism in a spaceship coming to Earth. Right now,
not illegal aliens.
But there's another theory of these UFO extraterrestrial experiences and sightings, which views them as not beings like us that are organic in quote unquote space time, but extra dimensional beings. So you have J. Allen Hynek from Project Blue Book, and then Jacques Vallée, who worked on this theory that UFOs have, as well as like medieval folklore with like elves and gnomes and goblins, and then ancient myths and legends of gods and such. That there's this extra dimensional set of beings which interface with humanity at various stages along its history.
So not just that they traveled here from a distant star within our three-dimensional space,
right.
but
right, and so they
popped over from another dimension.
But in order to communicate with us, they have to have culturally appropriate context, right? So they take appearances that we would be able to understand them, right? So they show up as gods, and they show up as elves, and they show up as aliens, right? That's sort of that theory. Now, I think that there's some legs to that kind of theory, because as a Christian, we do believe in angels and demons, so that does open the possibility for that. But I assume because it's an open-ended question, that we're talking about extraterrestrials, and I don't think they exist. And there's a lot of reasons for that. First of all, most people who think they do exist do so on the basis that they believe in evolution and that life could spontaneously develop on other planets. In fact, they assume it must have. And so they assume it's a statistical inevitability that you're going to find life on other planets. Now, if you don't believe that, as I don't, then no, I don't think you could have them there, because that mechanism for them to be generated on other planets isn't there. But no, if you do believe that,
I'd never thought about that before. But yes, do aliens exist is almost a strangely equivalent question to do you believe life on Earth originated through sort of mundane scientific origins, or was there the need for special divine intervention to anthropogenic no, what is the word? I don't remember. There's a word for
abiogenesis.
Yes, abiogenesis, exactly. Is it possible to have a naturally occurring abiogenetic event. I don't think that's a word either.
Right.
Sorry, carry on.
No, yeah. And so the idea that is, I can't think of the name of the astronomer now, but there was an astronomer who looked at all the variables and calculated that it was highly unlikely that there was extraterrestrial life. And one of the things that he said, and this was a secular scholar who did believe in Darwinian evolution, but he gave a number of reasons, and one of them was, well, we would have heard something from them by now. Like, where's the radio signals? Where's any sort of signal coming from any part of the galaxy that, it looks to all apparent, to all purposes, that we are alone. And really, anybody that argues that we aren't has a lot to actually prove, because for all intents and purposes, it looks like we are alone in the universe with regards to other, not just intelligent life, but other organic life outside of Earth. So I would say, no, I don't think they exist. Now, also, then, I guess from a theological point of view, because again, this does hinge on your view of metaphysics and everything. As a Christian, right, we believe in the act of creation on Earth in the opening chapter of Genesis. So God would have had to have done that some other place. And I'm not saying he couldn't have, but I just don't see any evidence that he did. Now, someone could point to C.S. Lewis and say, well, hey, Todd, what about C.S. Lewis's space trilogy, where, there's these, but those are angels, by the way, or demons, right? The Paralandra, the other planets, they're
spoilers.
Well, no, there are biological organisms on Mars. There's the Harasa, the Fifiltrigi, and the Horsa. But yeah, he didn't seem to think that was a problem. But I think that might be a problem, because one, I think Lewis might have actually believed in evolution. So the idea that they could have evolved on Mars would be something he would have accepted. But then also, God having two acts of creation. And in fact, Paralandra is about a second Adam and Eve and a potential second fall. Now that creates a whole set of problems, because how would, if Ransom hadn't stopped the Unman from corrupting the Green Lady, would there have to be a second incarnation? How would that work? I just feel like that adds a lot of wrinkles to the problem that, from a Christian point of view, make it very difficult to sustain.
By the way, I should have stuck with my intuition. The word for relating to abiogenesis is abiogenetic, because, of course, the word genetic is related to the word genesis. It's all to do with, origins and births and things. It's all out of the Greek. Okay, so your position is that there may be interdimensional or spiritual creatures, but they are not. But if you were to have an encounter with a UFO, it would not be because it had originated on a planet a long distance away with a group of biological creatures that evolved independently and then built the spaceship and came here.
Right, because again, the extra-dimensional theory is a theory of explaining aliens, but that's not very common even amongst the believers of alien encounters.
That's an interesting wrinkle I hadn't considered before. The question of how do we explain the evidence that people cite for aliens. Actually, there's first the question of, is the evidence credible? But then even if it is, there's actually quite a few different ways of potentially taking that, of what are your assumptions of where these alternative intelligences came from. I guess one last question. Do you have a view for how compelling the evidence is of UFOs and alien sightings and so on? I haven't really looked into it that deeply, but my impression has always been that there isn't very strong evidence, that the military videos that get released always seem to have fairly reasonable counter explanations to them. What do you think?
Well, I think So whenever I looked into this, right, there's like the sum total of all the data that's being like accumulated under the title UFOs. And I think a lot of that can be looked at and like, okay, this person is just misidentifying some mundane thing. Maybe it's the copycatting effect, right? But there's always these like core encounters and core sightings that are just not easy to handle. They're not easy to just sweep under the rug. And oftentimes the difference here is the person a trained observer, right? So a lot of these people are not trained observers, and so it's easy for them to make mistakes. But like if you have like a pilot who's a trained observer, if you have a radar operator who's a trained observer, like the 1952 UFO sightings over Washington D.C., which was the impetus for Project Blue Book. I mean, that gets a bit harder because these are trained observers, like the Foo Fighters in World War II, right? These are all these pilots are seeing things, and they're not just some yokel in the middle of nowhere who you can just write off as a hick, right? And then also the natures of some of these. So I would say there's this like core that is not easy to just ignore, and it's I don't have any specific case off the top of my head, but I would say that core is where I think we need to focus, and that's where the most interesting stuff can be gleaned.
Very good. All right. Well, I'm going to give you 15 points for that, which brings us to round 6, the final round: literature, software, and mathematics, or eschatology.
Literature.
The distinction between high and low genre fiction is arbitrary. Fictional narratives have great power, or the traditional literary canon is overrated.
Oh, man. There's a lot of good ones here. I'm going to go with the distinction between high and low genre fiction is arbitrary, against, or opposed.
Okay, let's hear it.
Okay, so this is going to double back to my discussion on music. So I started reading, what we would call high literature as a part of my homeschool curricula when I was in, middle school. And I read a lot more than I was required to because I liked what I was reading. And so, for whatever reason, I stumbled across the Western canon online. I was like, there were some books that were more modern that I would read, and I'm like, these don't really hit right. Then there were those that did, and I'm like, well, how do I get a filter? And I stumbled across, I think it was a website that had Harold Bloom's account of the Western canon. I'm like, oh, I'll just look at this and start reading books on this list. And then you get closer and closer to the 20th century, and then you get to the 20th century, and there's a fundamental change in literature where it becomes what you might call low. So let's use pulp, right? Pulp is going to be the stand-in for low genre fiction. And pulp really starts in like the 1910s with like Tarzan and by Edgar Rice Burroughs. And then, of course, you have Conan in the 30s with Howard. And pulp just kind of keeps going. And high literature, of course, let's say would be Shakespeare. Right? Shakespeare versus pulp. It's going to be like the easy differentiation here. The distinction is real, and it's this, right? So let's look at like King Lear, right? Shakespeare's King Lear. It's an imaginative retelling of the old English King Lear from Geoffrey of Monmouth and other sources. So what Shakespeare is doing is high literature is tapping into universal truths, right? If you were to read, okay, perfect example. So Alexander the Great reads the Iliad. He wants to LARP as Achilles, and he does, and he conquers an empire, right? And if you wanted to LARP as, Superman or Conan, you wouldn't get anywhere in life. People would just laugh at you and say, well, come on, grow up, dude. Like, you can't, what you read in that book, you can't do in real life because it's fiction. Now, that's the key distinction here, right? You could read the Iliad, you could read Shakespeare, and then incorporate those truths into your daily life, and it would have effects analogous to what you read about. Whereas with low genre literature, if you were to try to do that, you would just be seen as a clown, and it wouldn't get you anywhere unless, you were considered a funny clown and people wanted to promote you because they liked having you around. You can't do in real life what you read them do in the book.
Okay, so, but what about The Tempest or Midsummer Night's Dream?
With like magic because
Yeah.
you're kind of implying
That's kind of like Superman, isn't it?
No,
You know,
no, no.
there's
Because,
supernatural elements that are purely plot contrivances, I would argue, in those stories. No?
yeah. Let's make it with magic, though. I guess the question is, do we think magic could be real or not? Because I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'd say no. But the point is, though, here's the difference, right? Tolkien talks about this thing called the true myth, which is the idea that while the story itself might be entirely fictitious, it might have dragons and elves and wizards, right? None of which are real, but it points to a higher truth, a higher reality that is true in spite of itself, right? So if somebody wanted to imitate Bilbo Baggins in real life and learn the life lessons of the Hobbit, you could do that. I mean, it wouldn't be completely inconceivable, even though he's a completely fictitious character and a completely fictitious race of the Hobbit. And so there's this deeper meaning and truth to it that you can have by reading this. The other thing that low genre fiction has is lack of consequences. So, okay, obviously Iliad is a blood-drenched novel or epic. And, even, and then the whole Trojan cycle, most of these guys die, right? I mean, Achilles dies, you get to the Odyssey, and then you realize most of the Greek heroes are dead. Agamemnon comes home and gets killed by his wife and her lover. So the point is, you could be, a badass killing machine like Achilles. But he had a bargain. There was a deal, right? Foreshadowing. You could have a short life with glory or a long life without anybody knowing who you are. Whereas there's no consequences in, okay, I'll just go to Conan the Barbarian. I mean, you can't go around killing people like that indiscriminately without having anything happen. Nothing happens. He's not going to get killed. He's not going to have like angry relatives chase him down and be like, I'm going to avenge the blood of my, relative that you killed. It's completely escapist. It's sort of like an unlimited expression of a desire, power fantasy without any limit or consequence. And in that regard, I think a lot of low genre fiction is broadly, you could say, pornographic in the sense that it gives you this unlimited indulgence without any sort of consequences or prerequisites or anything like that. Whereas, the implication is with Achilles, he had to make a sort of like cosmic bargain. He had to train to be a warrior. Like a lot of these guys, it's just innate somehow. It's like, well, how? I mean, you still have to train, buddy. You still have to, even if you do have an innate talent for something. And so what it does is it creates a disassociation where we think that you can act in the world without consequence, without limit. And then it creates this sort of like, but you actually can't, right? You actually can't. But if you think you can, then you just run around complaining because of your unreasonable expectations that are never met.
Do you think that is the single question that can just kind of bifurcate all art into high and low? It's about whether there's consequences, whether there's a chord between reality and the fictional world of the book.
No, I mean, I think, again, like with music in the earlier discussion, is this the result of an embedded organic community? So right, when Shakespeare writes King Lear, he's engaging with like a classic British myth of their early history, right? But then he's like retelling that story in an Elizabethan 16th century context. Or, if it's actually, completely fictitious, like say Lord of the Rings, it's still inspired by truths that were found in history that he's transplanting to this fictional world to help, or Lewis's Narnia, to help us see these things better. Also, does it elevate you spiritually? Does it bring you to this, again, the other part, poetry, right? The King of Elfland's Daughter, Dunstan, he says certain things can only be said in song or poetry. So, okay, literature, high fiction can bring you to that point as well. And if those things are met as well, so to be high fiction, you have to meet all of these criteria. But I'm just picking, I think, what I think is the most stark distinction.
Hmm. Well, very, very well argued. And I'm going to give you 16 points for that, which brings us to the high score table. Let me refresh it. And oh, you were at the top.
I'm at the top.
From the bottom to the top. Never has there been such a leapfrog in Gauntlet history. So you are today's Gauntlet champion, having finally broken through the 89 barrier that seems to have been erected with these three. So very, very well done and congratulations.
Well, thank you, Luke. Pleasure.